In the summer of 1991, every grain elevator in Hardin County, Ohio, ran the same conveyor belt system. This was not a choice anyone had made consciously. It was the way the land lay flat, and the soybeans came in heavy in September, and the way the same equipment salesman had been driving the same route out of Kenton for 22 years. Meridian belt conveyors, steel frame, 3-inch idler rollers, factory-sealed bearings rated for indoor dry storage. That was what you bought. That was what your father bought. That was what every co-op manager in 4 counties would tell you to buy if you asked him, and most of them would look at you a little sideways if you asked why. Let me tell you about Virgil Cress, because you need to understand the man before you can understand what he did with 12 years and a machine shed full of other people's cast-offs. Virgil was 52 years old in 1991 and had managed the grain receiving operation at the Dunbar Farmers Cooperative for 19 years. He was not the kind of man who stood at the front of a room. He was the kind of man who stood at the back and watched the front very carefully. He had grown up on his family's 480-acre farm outside of McGuffey, the second of 4 children, and had spent his boyhood following his father, Russell, through the equipment barn with a rag in his back pocket and his eyes open. Russell Cress had been a methodical man. He kept a tin box on his workbench with index cards for every piece of equipment on the farm, and on each card he had written the service intervals, the part numbers, the dimensions of wear components, and the name of the vendor who could supply them. When Russell died in 1974, Virgil inherited the farm, the equipment, and the tin box. He sold the farm to his brother-in-law in 1977 when the co-op job came open. He kept the tin box. By 1991, the tin box had become 3 shoe boxes, one for each conveyor line at the Dunbar Co-op and one for the truck scale and the dryer systems. Virgil recorded everything: bearing temperatures at monthly intervals, belt tension measurements taken with a fish scale and a chalk mark, idler roller wear checked by hand every quarter. He could tell you, within a few thousandths of an inch, how much each roller had worn over the previous 5 years. None of his supervisors had ever asked him for any of this information. He kept it anyway. The man who ran the regional Meridian dealership was named Boyd Callister, and Boyd Callister was the kind of man who had a laminated card in his wallet with his quarterly sales rankings on it. He was 46 years old in 1991, drove a half-ton pickup that stayed cleaner than most people's kitchen tables, and had built his dealership in Findlay into the dominant conveyor equipment supplier for a 12-county region over 18 years. He sold Meridian exclusively. He had the service contracts for 4 county co-ops and 2 private grain terminals. When Boyd Callister told a co-op manager what system to buy, the manager bought it. Boyd's service model was clean and profitable. A failed bearing assembly pulled from service, logged as non-rebuildable under the Meridian service classification, shipped back to the regional depot, warranty credit applied, replacement installed, service call billed. The returned components came back from the depot, marked for disposal. Boyd's shop disposed of them in the way that busy shops dispose of things they're not thinking about, which is to say they put them in a corner and wait for the corner to fill up, and then they put them in a bigger corner. By 1994, the back bay of Boyd's shop had an accumulation of returned conveyor components that occupied roughly 400 square feet of floor space. Idler frames, bearing housings, drive head assemblies with scored shafts, belt scrapers, roller clusters. Some of it was genuinely finished. A lot of it was not. Virgil Cress had been watching the failure patterns at the Dunbar Co-op for years. The Meridian system was designed for the kinds of grain volumes and moisture contents you found in Kansas and Nebraska, where the elevators ran drier grain and the harvest seasons were more compressed. In western Ohio, the corn came in green. The soybeans came in at 14, 15, 16% moisture in a wet October, and they went through the dryer before they went into storage, and the condensation that came off a hot grain dryer and settled on cold steel bearing housings in November was not something the Meridian factory engineers had spent much time thinking about. The sealed bearings that Meridian used were good bearings for what they were designed for. They were not especially good for running 3 shifts during a wet Ohio harvest while condensation worked into the seals from the outside. Virgil knew this because he had measured it. He had pulled failed bearing assemblies from the co-op's own conveyors after warranty replacement and disassembled them himself on his workbench at home, which was a workbench that his father Russell's old vise still sat on, the same vise with the same worn jaw plates that Virgil had been looking at his whole life. What he found in those failed bearings was not what the Meridian service documentation said he would find. The documentation said the failure mode was inadequate lubrication. What Virgil found was moisture intrusion. The grease in the bearing races was emulsified. The balls were pitted. The inner races had rust blooms that started from the outside inward, not from friction heat. This was not a lubrication problem. This was a seal problem. This was a design problem for this climate, for these conditions, for this specific corner of Ohio where October meant something different than it meant in Wichita. He had written this down. He had written it on an index card and put it in the shoebox, and he had not told Boyd Callister because Boyd Callister had not asked. What Virgil had been thinking about, quietly, for several years, was a different bearing configuration. Agricultural equipment used in wet harvest environments in the Midwest had been moving toward a labyrinth seal design for exactly the reason Virgil had documented in his failed units. The labyrinth seal did not rely on a single elastomeric contact seal to exclude moisture. It used a series of interlocking grooves and channels that made water intrusion geometrically difficult rather than mechanically resistant. A contact seal could fail from a single compromise. A labyrinth seal had no single point of failure. The bearing housings that used labyrinth seals were not a Meridian product. They were made by a smaller manufacturer in Wooster, Ohio, a company called Hartwell Bearing that had been supplying agricultural and food processing equipment for 40 years. Virgil had driven to Wooster in 1989 and spent an afternoon with Hartwell's sales engineer, a man named Ed Vogt, looking at the labyrinth housing designs. He had come home with a catalog and a box of sample components, and he had spent 2 evenings measuring them against the dimensions of the Meridian idler frames sitting in the co-op's maintenance bay. They were not a direct fit. The bolt pattern was different. The shaft diameter tolerances were different. But they were not incompatibly different. They were different in the way that things built by 2 companies to solve the same problem are different. Which is to say that someone with enough patience and the right drill press could make them work together. Virgil did not do anything with this knowledge in 1989. He was not ready. He was still measuring. In the spring of 1993, Virgil drove to Boyd Callister's shop in Findlay to pick up a parts order. He was early, and the counterman was in the back, and so Virgil walked around the outside of the building and looked at the rear bay where the returned components were stacked. The door was open. He stood at the edge of the doorway and looked at the idler frames and the bearing housings and the drive assemblies on the floor and on the shelving units along the wall. He stood there for perhaps 90 seconds. Then he went back around front and collected his parts. That evening he called Boyd Callister. He told Boyd he had seen the returned components in the back bay. He told Boyd he thought he might be able to use some of them. He explained that he had been looking at a modification to the standard Meridian idler configuration, a bearing housing substitution that he believed would address the moisture intrusion problem he had been seeing in wet harvest service, and that he would need donor frames and shafts to develop the prototype, and that it looked like Boyd had plenty of those. The silence on the line lasted about 3 seconds. Then Boyd Callister said, "Virgil, those components failed. That's why they're back here. The warranty system doesn't send me good parts." Virgil said he understood that, but that he believed the failure mode was in the seals, not in the structural components, and that the frames and shafts were likely still serviceable. Boyd said he was not a bearing engineer, and neither was Virgil, and that Meridian's service documentation classified those units as non-rebuildable for a reason, and that if Virgil wanted to spend his evenings in his garage taking apart failed conveyor parts, that was certainly his time to spend, but that Boyd was not going to stand behind whatever came out of that garage if it ended up in a commercial elevator. He did not laugh. That is worth saying. Boyd Callister was not a mean man, and his thoroughness was organized around systems he trusted, and this proposal did not fit inside any of those systems. And when something does not fit inside a thorough man's systems, his response is not mockery, but a kind of careful dismissal that is, in its way, harder to argue with than mockery. It has the quality of a door being shut quietly and firmly rather than slammed. Boyd said Virgil was welcome to take whatever he wanted from the back bay. He said it would save him the disposal cost. Virgil borrowed a flatbed trailer from his brother-in-law and made 2 trips to Findlay over the following weekend. He came away with 38 idler frame assemblies, 22 bearing housings in various states of condition, 4 drive head units with damaged shafts, and several bins of loose components. He stacked them in the equipment shed on his property outside of McGuffey, the same shed where his father had kept the tractor through 3 decades of Ohio winters. He tagged everything with masking tape and a Sharpie. He started a new shoebox. Let me tell you about what Virgil found when he started taking things apart, because the findings are why the next 12 years unfolded the way they did. Of the 38 idler frame assemblies, 14 had structural damage that Virgil considered genuine. Bent frames, cracked welds, mounting holes that had elongated from vibration beyond what could be corrected by bushing. He set those aside. He was not sentimental about steel that was finished. 24 frames were sound. The steel was straight. The welds were intact. The mounting surfaces were flat within the tolerances he could measure with his machinist's level. He cleaned them with solvent and a wire brush and measured every critical dimension and wrote it down. The bearing housings were more interesting. Every single housing had a seal failure of some kind, but the housings themselves, the cast iron bodies, the machined bore surfaces, the shaft clearances, were in far better condition than the seal failures suggested. When you pulled the failed seals and cleaned the bores and measured them, you found cast iron that had barely worn, because the failure had not been internal friction. The failure had been water getting in. The housing had not been destroyed by what it was doing. It had been undermined by what it was not keeping out. Virgil drove back to Worcester and talked to Ed Vogt again. He brought his measurements. He brought 2 of the failed Meridian housings for Vogt to look at. Vogt looked at them for a while and said the bore dimensions were close enough to the Hartwell Labyrinth housing that it might be worth trying a directed installation, but the bolt pattern would need to be adapted. He said Hartwell didn't make an adapter plate for Meridian frames and never would, because Hartwell and Meridian were not in the business of making each other's systems interoperable. He said if Virgil could provide a drawing, he knew a machine shop in Ashland that could cut adapter plates to spec. Virgil went home and drew the adapter plates on graph paper at his kitchen table. He was 54 years old and had not taken a drafting class since high school, but he had been measuring things and writing them down for 30 years, and the drawing took him 2 evenings, and when he was done, it was dimensioned to the hundredths. And he knew it was right because he had checked every measurement 3 times against the actual components before he committed it to paper. He mailed the drawing to the machine shop in Ashland. They called him back in a week and said they could have 12 plates ready in 10 days. He said he would need 24 to start. Let me tell you about what happened when he put the first rebuilt unit together, because you need to understand why it worked before you can understand what happened when people found out. The rebuilt idler assembly used a sound meridian frame, a Hartwell labyrinth bearing housing, a new shaft of the correct diameter sourced from a bearing supplier in Lima, and the adapter plate from Ashland. The total parts cost per assembly was approximately $60. A new Meridian replacement idler with standard sealed bearing was priced at $230 at the Boyd Callister dealership. Virgil built a test rig in his shed. He had a small electric motor from a defunct grain auger, a length of conveyor belt salvaged from a co-op disposal, and a 5-gallon garden sprayer filled with water. He ran the rebuilt idler under load and sprayed the housing with water for an hour at a time to simulate the condensation environment of a grain dryer exhaust. He ran it for a week this way, 8 hours a day, then disassembled it and inspected the bearing surfaces. There was no moisture in the bearing race. The labyrinth channels had done exactly what they were designed to do. He ran it for another week. Same result. He wrote the results in the shoebox. He spent the following 3 years rebuilding 22 usable assemblies from the components he had retrieved from Boyd's back bay. He worked in the evenings and on winter weekends. He was not in a hurry. He had a full-time job running the Dunbar Co-op's receiving operation. He rebuilt when he had time, and he did not rush because rushing was not in the tin box tradition. By 1997, he had 22 complete rebuilt assemblies on wooden pallets in the shed, labeled and documented, each one with a test log in the shoebox. He had spent approximately $2,800 on parts and machining. The equivalent new Meridian equipment would have cost north of $5,000. He did not call Boyd Callister. Let me tell you about what was happening at the Boyd Callister dealership during those same years, because the story has 2 tracks, and understanding both of them is the only way the ending makes sense. Boyd had continued selling Meridian systems through the mid-90s. The wet harvest bearing failures had continued on the same cycle. Boyd had adapted his service model accordingly, which is to say he had gotten very good at billing efficiently for bearing replacements that came back 18 months later and needed to be billed for again. His service technicians knew the Meridian idler system the way surgeons know a procedure they have performed many hundreds of times. They were fast, and they were good, and they did not ask whether there might be a better approach, because the approach they had was profitable and familiar, and Boyd did not pay them to ask that kind of question. In 1999, the Meridian Regional Distributor changed hands. The new ownership renegotiated the warranty terms for all dealers. The replacement window dropped from 24 months to 15. A failure documentation requirement was added that specified the failed component had to be returned with a completed service ticket showing installation date and operating hours. Boyd's service tickets had never tracked operating hours. They tracked calendar dates. For the first 6 months under the new terms, he was able to piece together the documentation from service records. For the next 18 months, he ate 4 warranty claim denials that cost him a combined $11,000. He changed his service ticket format. He hired a part-time office person to manage the documentation. His margins compressed anyway because the new ticket format slowed his technicians down, and he hadn't accounted for that in his labor rates. By 2002, Boyd's 12-person operation had become a 9-person operation. His service volume was holding, but his per-job profitability was down. He was the dominant dealer in his region. He was still the man who drove the clean pickup, but the pickup was 2 years older than it used to be when he traded. In the autumn of 2003, a farmer named Walt Greer, who ran a small private grain storage operation on his property outside of Ada, had 2 idler assemblies fail during harvest. Boyd's shop was backlogged with co-op service calls and couldn't get to Walt for 11 days. Walt called Virgil, who he had known for 20 years from the co-op, and asked if Virgil knew anyone who could help. Virgil told Walt to come out to the shed. Walt came the next morning. Virgil showed him the rebuilt assemblies. He showed him the test logs. He showed him the adapter plate drawing on graph paper, and the Hartwell catalog page for the labyrinth housing, and the measurement records for the donor components. He told Walt the assembly would cost him $90 in parts and 2 hours of Virgil's time, and that if either unit failed inside 2 years, Virgil would replace it from inventory at no charge. Walt said yes. Virgil installed both assemblies on a Saturday morning in October. They ran through the rest of harvest without incident. The flow rate through Walt's handling system was smoother than it had been before the failures, which Virgil could explain because the labyrinth housing ran with lower internal friction than the worn contact seals on the old Meridian units, but which Walt simply noticed as a quieter, steadier line. Word in Hardin County moves the way grain moves through a leg elevator, steadily, without fanfare, and in larger volumes than you expect when you're standing at the bottom. By spring of 2004, Virgil had installed rebuilt assemblies for 6 private grain operations in the county. By the end of 2004, he had installed 11. Not one had failed. He kept a separate section in the shoebox for installation records, 1 card per customer, with the date, the assembly number from the pallet tag, and the measured belt tension and bearing temperature at startup. Let me tell you about when Boyd Callister heard, because men who have been the biggest dealer in a 12-county region for 20 years hear things in a particular way. Boyd drove out to Virgil's property on a Tuesday in February of 2005. He did not call ahead. He came in his still cleaner than it should have been for February, and he found Virgil in the shed sorting components with his barn hon and a cup of coffee sitting on the pallet next to him. Boyd stood at the shed door with his hands in his jacket pockets and said he had been hearing things about idler assemblies. Virgil said he supposed he had. Boyd asked if he could look at what Virgil had. Virgil stepped aside and let him in. Boyd walked the row of assemblies on the pallets. He picked up the shoebox and looked at the installation cards. He set it down. He crouched and looked at the adapter plate on the nearest unit, the junction where the Hartwell housing met the Meridian frame through the machined plate from Ashland, and he looked at it for a long time without saying anything. Then he stood up. He said these started as my returns. Virgil said they did. Boyd said, "How many are running?" Virgil said 11. Boyd said, "Any failures?" Virgil said no. Boyd looked at the shoebox again. He looked at the graph paper drawing that was tucked behind the installation cards, Virgil's kitchen table drawing with the handwritten dimensions, and his expression was the expression of a man who is encountering information that does not fit inside any of his systems, and who is deciding in real time what to do with it. He said, "I need to tell you that Meridian's warranty terms don't extend to modified configurations." Virgil said he was aware of that. Boyd said, "And you're not a licensed distributor." Virgil said he was not selling them. He was installing them for his neighbors at cost. Boyd said, "People are going to start asking me why they should buy new when they can call you." Virgil said he imagined they would. There was a silence that lasted long enough to mean something. Boyd picked up his coffee cup by reflex and then realized it was Virgil's coffee cup and set it back down. He walked to the shed door. He stood there for a moment with his back to the room, and then he turned and said, "Those housings are going to need service eventually. You know that." Virgil said he did. He said he had service records on all of them and knew what the intervals should be. Boyd nodded once and drove away. Have you ever watched a man drive down a gravel road toward a situation he has spent 20 years making inevitable, and tried to understand what he knows in that moment about himself? Because Boyd Callister drove 34 miles back to Findlay, knowing that the components he had been warehousing as disposal cost had been rebuilt into running equipment by a co-op manager, with a graph paper drawing and a machine shop in Ashland and an evening schedule. He drove back knowing that 11 of the farms in his service territory were running those components. He drove back knowing that in 1993, when Virgil had called him on the phone and explained exactly what he was proposing to do, Boyd had said the word "cobbled together" in a tone that meant something specific about Boyd's opinion of people who proposed solutions outside his systems. That is a particular kind of knowledge to carry 34 miles. It does not get lighter with distance. Boyd's dealership closed in the spring of 2008. It was the long kind of closing, the kind where the service backlog shrinks a little each month, and the parts orders don't get reordered because there's always next month to do it, and then one day there isn't a next month anymore. He had lost 2 co-op contracts in 2006 to a competitor out of Toledo, who was offering a Japanese-manufactured idler system with labyrinth seals as a standard configuration, something that had come onto the market in 2004 and that Boyd had looked at and decided not to carry because switching lines meant retraining his technicians and his parts inventory was all Meridian, and the transition cost was more than he wanted to face. He kept his Meridian line. The Toledo company took the co-ops. In March of 2008, Boyd called his remaining technicians together on a Monday morning and told them he was closing at the end of the month. He sold the shop equipment and remaining parts inventory to the Toledo company and retired to a house in Bluffton where he planted a large garden and kept his pickup clean and did not talk about conveyor systems. Virgil Cress heard about the closure from Walt Greer, who had heard about it from his brother-in-law who worked at one of the co-ops. Virgil was 68 years old and had been running the Dunbar Co-op's receiving operation for 31 years. He had 19 of his rebuilt assemblies installed in customer operations across the county. He had 3 units remaining on the pallet in the shed. His daughter, Janet, had been coming out to the property on weekends since 2001 to help with the larger installation jobs. She was 41 years old and had spent her working life in industrial maintenance at a plastics plant in Lima, and she had her father's habit of measuring things before she touched them and her father's habit of writing down what she found. She had read the shoe boxes. She knew every unit in the shed. When Virgil's knees made the installation work difficult in the mid-2010s, and Janet took over the customer service side of the operation, the shed and the shoe boxes passed with it in the way that certain kinds of knowledge pass, not through instruction, but through proximity and attention over a long period of time. Let me tell you about what Janet did with what her father had built, because this is the part of the story that explains why it is still a story worth telling. Janet did not treat the remaining units as surplus to be used up. She treated them, the way her father had treated everything in the shoeboxes as things that deserved to be understood before they were deployed. She pulled each of the 3 remaining assemblies, inspected every component for storage degradation, replaced 2 shaft seals that had dried during the years on the pallet, and returned them to service condition with updated logs. She was, as her father had been, meticulous in the way that people become meticulous when they have watched someone else be meticulous for decades and understood that the care is not about perfection, but about respect for what the thing is and what it can do. In 2016, a grain operation outside of Kenton, run by a man named Stuart Oakes, had 3 idler failures during a wet October harvest. Stuart was 63 years old and had been buying service from the Toledo Company since Boyd's shop closed. The Toledo Company quoted him 12 days for parts and $2,400 for 3 replacement assemblies installed. Stuart called Janet. Janet drove out to Stuart's operation the following morning with a tape measure and a notepad. She measured the failed assemblies and confirmed they were compatible with the donor stock her father had left in the shed. She showed Stuart the shoebox entries for those specific units, the original retrieval date from Boyd's back bay, the test log, the installation history on the 2 that had been previously installed for other customers and returned to inventory when those customers had upgraded their systems. Stuart looked at the shoebox entries for a long time. He looked at the graph paper drawing that was still tucked at the back, the kitchen table drawing with Virgil's careful handwriting. He said, "Your father made this?" Janet said he did. Stuart said, "When?" Janet said 1993. She said he was 54. Stuart said he would take all 3. Janet installed them over 2 days that week. She recorded everything in the shoeboxes. All 3 ran through the rest of harvest and through the following 4 harvest seasons without incident. Let me tell you one last thing about Virgil Cress, because he earned it. Virgil died in January of 2021 at the age of 81. He had managed the Dunbar Co-op receiving operation for 31 years and had never had a conveyor failure during harvest on his watch, not in the original Meridian lines, and not in the lines where he had quietly substituted his rebuilt assemblies for the worst failing units over the years, which he had done with the Co-op Board's informal knowledge and their complete formal ignorance, an arrangement that suited everyone involved. The last entry in his service shoeboxes was dated September of 2019. He had driven out to check on one of his installations at a farm east of Dunbar and had measured the bearing temperature at operating load and found it within 2 degrees of the startup reading from 15 years prior. He had written this on the card and added a small note at the bottom. Labyrinth holding. Moisture never got in. His memorial service was at the United Methodist Church in McGuffey. There were people from the co-op, people from the farms where his equipment was running, a few people from the Findlay area who had known him from the equipment supply world and who understood, without anyone having to say it directly, the specific significance of what he had built over the preceding 3 decades. Boyd Callister came. He drove from Bluffton in the clean pickup that was now a decade old. He sat near the back. After the service, during the reception in the fellowship hall, he stood for a long time in front of the photographs that Janet had arranged on a folding table near the entrance. Virgil in his barn coat in the shed with the shoeboxes visible on the shelf behind him. Virgil and Janet installing an assembly at Walt Greer's property in 2004. Virgil with a wrench and Janet holding the component steady, both of them looking at the fitting rather than at the camera. Virgil at his kitchen table with the graph paper and a mechanical pencil. Boyd looked at that last one for a long time. Then he shook Janet's hand, said something quiet, that she heard but did not repeat to anyone afterward, and drove back to Bluffton. Janet watched him go from across the room. She understood what his being there meant. She did not say anything about it, because her father had not been the kind of man who needed to hear people admit they had been wrong, and she was her father's daughter. The 3 assemblies that Stuart Oaks had installed in 2016 are still running. In 2022, Janet sourced a supply of new Hartwell Labyrinth housings and began offering rebuilt assemblies made entirely from new components rather than salvage, which her father would have considered an improvement, and which she considers a continuation of the same argument he started in 1993 at his kitchen table with a mechanical pencil, and a catalog open to the page with the labyrinth housing dimensions. The shoeboxes are in the shed on the same shelf where Virgil kept them. Janet has started scanning the cards, 1 shoebox at a time, on winter evenings when the work is slow. The originals stay in the boxes. She is not ready to let go of the handwriting. There is a photograph on the workbench, not hung on the wall but set in a frame that leans against the pegboard. It was taken by Janet's husband in 2003, the first season after Virgil started doing installations for the neighbors. It shows Virgil at the bench with the old vise in the foreground, the one with the worn jaw plates that Russell Cress had mounted to the bench in 1961. Virgil is holding one of the adapter plates up to the light from the shop window, examining the machined surface. He is not looking at the camera. He is looking at the plate, at the thing he had drawn on graph paper at his kitchen table, and then held in his hands for the first time, confirming that it was what he had known it would be. Janet sees it every morning when she opens the shed. Boyd Callister's shop is a storage unit rental business now. The building is the same. The sign is different. The clean bays where Boyd's technicians used to pull Meridian idlers in 40 minutes flat are full of other people's furniture and seasonal equipment and the things that people accumulate and don't know what to do with. It is a reasonable use for a building. It is not what the building was for. 38 idler frames went into that shed in McGuffey as other people's disposal problem. 24 of them became something else. 19 of those 24 ran in commercial grain operations across Hardin County for 15 years or more without a moisture failure, in a climate and a harvest season that the original design had never been built to accommodate. Virgil Cress knew the design was wrong for this place in 1989 when he disassembled the failed bearings on his workbench and found the emulsified grease and the rust blooms growing inward from the seal face. He knew it in 1993 when he stood at Boyd Callister's back bay door and saw what was stacked inside. He knew it when Boyd said the word cobbled together with that particular quiet emphasis, and Virgil said, simply, that he understood, and drove home and started the first card in the new shoebox. He knew it the way that people know things when they have been writing down what they observe for 30 years and have stopped needing anyone else to confirm it. Some things are not scrap because they have failed. Some things have failed because they were never right for where they were asked to work. Those are different problems, and only one of them needs a new part. The other one needs someone who has been paying close enough attention to know the difference. I think about Virgil standing at Boyd Callister's back bay door in 1993 looking at 38 frames stacked on a concrete floor, and I wonder how many people would have seen the same thing he saw. Most of us would have seen junk. Virgil saw a question that hadn't been answered correctly yet. That's the part that stays with me. Not the rebuilding, not the 12 years of evenings at the bench, not even the moment Boyd drove out to the shed and read the shoebox cards and couldn't say anything for a long time. It's the moment before all of that, The moment Virgil looked at what the system had discarded and quietly decided the system was wrong. Not with anger, not with any need to prove anything to anyone, just with the calm certainty of a man who had been writing down what he observed for 30 years and had stopped needing outside confirmation. I've known people like that, and they share something. It isn't stubbornness, though it can look like it from the outside. It's a kind of intellectual honesty that most of us find exhausting to maintain. They don't let what's convenient replace what's accurate. Virgil knew those bearings were failing from moisture intrusion in 1989. He knew it because he had disassembled the failed units on his own workbench on his own time and looked at what was actually there rather than what the service documentation said he would find. That discipline, the discipline of seeing clearly, even when the clear view is inconvenient or lonely, is what made everything else possible. Without it, the shoeboxes are empty. Without the shoeboxes, there's no graph paper drawing. Without the drawing, there's no machine shop in Ashland, no adapter plate, no rebuilt assembly running through a wet Ohio October without a single moisture failure. And then there's the question of what it takes to keep going when no one is watching and no one is asking. Virgil rebuilt those assemblies in the evenings, in the winters, alone in a shed that had been his father's shed, at a bench with his father's vise. He wasn't building toward a payoff he could see clearly. He was building because the problem was real, and he understood it, and he had the skills to address it, and that was enough reason. I find that harder than it sounds. Most of us need some visible progress, some external acknowledgement, something that tells us the effort is landing somewhere. Virgil had his shoeboxes. He had the numbers from the test rig. He had the bearing surfaces that came apart clean after a week of spray testing and told him without any ambiguity that he had built the right thing. That was enough. What Boyd Callister's closed shop teaches me is that systems built on avoiding inconvenient questions have a carrying cost that doesn't show up on the service invoice. Boyd wasn't dishonest. He was thorough within the boundaries of what he had decided to pay attention to. But the moisture was in the bearings regardless of whether he was looking, and eventually the weight of that unexamined problem transferred to margin compression, to lost contracts, to a building that now rents storage space to people who don't know what it used to be. Virgil's shed is still a shed. The shoeboxes are still on the shelf. Janet is still scanning the cards, winter evenings, one shoebox at a time. That continuity isn't accidental. It's what happens when a person does right work, carefully, with honesty about what they're actually seeing, and then passes that habit to someone who was paying attention. The equipment outlasted the dealership. The records outlasted the man. That's not luck. That's the long return on a particular kind of integrity.